After listening to today's episode, you will never look at podcast content repurposing the same way. You will see that there is a whole new way of understanding how this kind of repurposing can work, how it can work to benefit you, your business, and your podcast, and what are some of the misconceptions you might have had about podcast content repurposing. And together, we will get rid of all of them today. This is Say Yes to Podcasting, where solopreneurs learn how to start podcasts that attract their ideal clients and do the marketing for them. I'm your host, Anja Lordanic. Let's launch your show. Now, most people, or I should say most podcasters, think that repurposing means essentially doing more work after you publish your podcast episode. So let's say you just recorded, edited, and published your new podcast episode for the week. And the next logical step for you to do would be to get AI involved, to chop up some parts of your episode, to slap on some captions, and call it a day. And then you post those clips all over social media, whether it be LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, it doesn't really matter. That is the standard way we use to look at content repurposing. And that kind of way of thinking has its time and a place, and there should be a different kind of strategy involved if we decide to post clips on social media. Because the root of the problem is we treat every platform the same, and that is mistake number one. We as consumers don't behave the same if we're browsing TikTok, if we're on LinkedIn, if we're on Instagram, or if we're listening to podcasts. We're assuming different personas, and each time we scroll through our feeds, we're not necessarily ready to go ahead and listen to the podcast, even after seeing a beautifully created clip with great production, great audio. We're not ready. We're not there to do that. We're not spending our time on Instagram trying to look for new podcasts to listen to. So that is why I said that is mistake number one. We should treat each platform differently, the way it deserves. And you might have heard me say this before, but we should meet people where they're at. We should respect the way people are behaving on each platform and post content accordingly. So that is why I said that content repurposing this way is not necessarily correct and will not get you new listeners. You should ask me how I know this. Well, as most podcasters, that is what I did. That is what I did week after week and decided to pull up great quotes from interviews I had with my guests on my previous podcast. And I thought that that way I'm attracting new listeners to my show from LinkedIn specifically, because that's the platform I use the most. Needless to say, I was wrong and that didn't work. What that did is probably raise some awareness that I have a podcast in the first place. And maybe at some point, someone, when they thought about listening to a podcast, okay, now I have the time to listen to a podcast. What should I do? Oh, yeah, that lady Anya has a podcast. I remember seeing her post on LinkedIn. Let me check her out. That might have happened, but those numbers were few and far between. Now, I know I promised that in today's episode, we would kill two birds with one stone. And I have to say, I'm not a fan of birds at all, or either kind of bird, but I'm not ready to kill them. We are just speaking in metaphors here. So let me share what I mean. Podcast content repurposing, as I see it, is actually about working smart, thinking ahead, reverse engineering what you want to achieve, and then trying to come up with a strategy. To make this even more practical, this episode is essentially about guesting as a content strategy. Now, let me explain why, when you're a podcast guest, you're not done with an interview once the interview ends. This is where the story actually begins for you. When you're a guest on other people's shows, they're shining a spotlight on you. You're using your voice, your way of thinking, your experience, you're sharing your stories, your client successes, your client wins, your failures even. You're relating your story to their audience's story. And I already alluded to podcast guesting in one of my previous episodes, and I will link to that episode in the show notes so you can check out that one next. So when you're guesting on a show whose audience is not yet familiar with you, you're actually teaching, explaining, clarifying your ideas. You're actually, throughout the whole interview, creating content without realizing it. You're creating content effortlessly. You're connecting with their audience and you're creating content for yourself as well, whether you realize that or not. So, I want you to look at podcast guesting differently. You're not just doing an interview and creating content for another person's platform. You are doing that, of course, but you can also use that content for your own good. And you can do this in many different ways. And I've done this before. So I know how beneficial it can be. For example, if you had a 30-minute interview on another person's show and you talked about three or four mini topics or subtopics during that interview, that means that you might have three or four podcast episodes ready to go right then and there for your own show. That is what I did on multiple occasions. And I cannot tell you how helpful it is to have an audio that is ready made. You just need to record an intro, an outro maybe, and announce the episode as your guest episode, as a part of your interview you had with an XYZ host. And of course, you will always credit the host and link to their show in your show notes. However, if you don't want to use that same audio files, the exact audio files the host send you, you can actually extract a couple of topics you talked about and re record them or talk about them from a different angle. Here, we're talking about your IP, about your own words. So it is absolutely okay to reuse ideas you shared elsewhere. Just take a look at well known entrepreneurs or authors or athletes. They keep reusing the same ideas and they keep resharing them on each TV show, podcast, interview they do. That is completely normal. In essence, different audiences require different context, and different angles will land differently with a certain type of audience. So you're absolutely allowed to say the same thing again in the same way or in a different way using a different angle. Now, to make things even more practical, how can you actually reuse the audio or the interview you gave on another person's podcast? After you're done with the interview, while it's still fresh on your mind, you can ask yourself some of these questions. What question did I give a great answer to? What explanation felt really compelling? Something that will apply to my audience as well. What framework did I mention? What client story did I mention? You can reuse and repurpose any and all of these for your podcast episodes. So, in short, each interview you give can produce 3, 4, 5 solo episodes for your own show. Isn't that great? I get excited guesting on other people's shows for this reason alone, and much better than actually repurposing the content as we know it on social media without any clear plan or structure. And if you're concerned that this will feel repetitive, I already mentioned repurposing and reusing old ideas and telling them in a new way. This will not feel repetitive to your listeners because most of them will not hear the interview or they will need to hear the same idea more than once, even said in the same way. I know that is the case with me when I'm absorbing new content. In reality, repetition builds clarity, authority, recognition, and saves you time, saves you energy. You don't have to think about new content ideas all the time. And you're more inclined and more motivated to reach out to other podcast hosts who will interview you for their show. And once you approach them, not only with a pitch, not only by telling them what you can provide to their audience, but when you tell them, I have the system I use after each interview, I actually repurpose that content on my own podcast and I promote your show that way. That is a win win. And that podcast host is more likely to say yes to your pitch. Now, let's recap what we talked about today. Repurposing is not just about clips on social media. Repurposing can mean so much more. You can use guesting on other people's shows and repurpose that content instead. That is what I mean when I say killing two birds with one stone. You're guesting on other people's shows, getting introduced to other audiences, and you're using that content for your own podcast, and you don't need to re record anything if you don't want to. I know I was blown away when I learned that I could do this. This saves so much time, so much energy, and it is beneficial for everyone, for me, for the host, for their audience, for my listeners, and everyone wins. So I would love to know what stood out to you in today's episode. Is there something in particular that caught your eye or ear. If something clicked, or if it made you even rethink repurposing podcast content, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and tell me what stood out to you today. I always appreciate getting new reviews and seeing what you all think about the show. Thank you, and I will see you in the next episode.